Hi there, and welcome to a short video highlighting different types of antigens. So first I'm going to talk about the kind of different macromolecules that typically present as antigens, and then talk about some subtypes of antigens themselves. So the antigens, again, are recognized by the body as being foreign, and they are often proteins or polypeptides. But they can be other molecules as well. So they can be lipoproteins. So again, we get kind of going back to the protein base there. Glycoproteins. Nucleoproteins, so not just DNA, but DNA that's complex with a different protein. That's important because we wouldn't want to recognize DNA in general as an antigen, since we rely on that obviously in our cells. Polysaccharides. And lipopolysaccharides. So of course, microbiology students will be familiar with the lipopolysaccharide layer on gram-negative cells. So there's something you can kind of connect that to right there. So antigen is a term that's often used, but often we are really talking about what's called the epitope. And the epitope is a fragment or part of the antigen that actually binds to the different markers. So if we're looking at an antigen, for example, binding to a B cell receptor, we might be looking at the whole antigen, but there's pieces of it on there that are called epitopes. And sometimes the term antigen is just generally used, but there's actually smaller different pieces on the bacterial cell, for example, that act as epitopes, which is a great thing, because if you have different compounds or different molecules that will act as epitopes, it's just even more places, more opportunities to stimulate the lymphocyte system, because you can have even more binding that's there, or any of the white blood cell system. We can also talk about alloantigens. And those are same species antigens. And a common one that people are familiar with are the blood types. So human to human, if you are, for example, a type A blood and you get a type B transfusion, it's still human, but your body would recognize that as being antigenic, because you're an A blood type, and so you would have you would ultimately make antibodies against that B blood type. It's also super antigens. These are antigens that elicit a huge response. So super high activation, and T cells are often discussed. It's going to do things like really ramp up inflammation, and can be very deadly very quickly. So for some reason, they just cause a really strong reaction. One of the examples that's often used is toxic shock syndrome, but lots of others out there. And often it's mentioned as the T cells themselves as being a key component that overreact sort of to these antigens. Then there's allergens. And allergens are just simply antigens that are linked to allergy. And so you can have a localized response or atopy. So if you have seasonal allergies, so itchy nose, watery eyes, that's that local response. Or it can be systemic and lead to things like anaphylaxis, where you have this body-wide response. And that's, of course, a much more deadly response that we worry about, systemic, so throughout the body. Okay, last thing I want to mention are haptens, and haptens are a molecule that's really too small to stimulate that antigenic response all by itself, but they will bind to they combine to what's called these larger molecules, like proteins in your serum, for example, called carriers. And then only when it binds to those carrier molecules, then it'll generate an immune response. So some examples that are used of that are maybe household cleaners. So, you might anecdotally hear about someone say, oh, I used this laundry soap for years and years, all of a sudden one day it made my skin really itchy. So there could be different things going on there, but the idea is that the molecules, which were too small to generate a response, for some reason at some point started binding to some of these carrier molecules, and then they became big enough that they looked like an antigen. So the body sees something foreign, the small molecule, but it's attached to something big enough that it'll recognize it. Okay. So that's all I have. So this just goes through again some of the macromolecule types that will be antigens, and then just some of the categories of antigens that you'll see out there. I thank you very much. This is Corey Andres at Central New Mexico Community College using C&M Glass.